to welcome our almost last speaker in our series of webinars. Within this, the series is called Conservation and Transformation in Ethics and Religion. So we move in between the two poles of conservation and transformation. Today, if I'm not wrong, is conservation, the pole that. But of course, the impact of the conservation on our idea of transformation is always there. So interesting. The title of the webinar today is Where AI, the Sciences and the Humanities Converge: Innovation in Manuscript Research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the lecture focuses on very famous Dead Sea Scrolls and the people who wrote and copied them. So a very adventurous element in our so key aspect of the understanding of one of the pillars of our religious tradition. So it's a very interesting topic, and our speaker today is Mladen Popović. As professor of Old Testament and Ancient Judaism at the University of Groningen, and is here with us. We are very glad to have him here. He's also dean of the Faculty of Religion, Culture, and Society, and leaving the floor to Professor Popović and thank him for being with us today and for the talk he's about to deliver. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for his kind words of welcome and also for the invitation. Very happy to be here. I'm not dean anymore of faculty.
Okay.
I was for 8 years until the 1st of September.
Okay.
So I'm a former dean. I will try in my lecture to connect with what I understood, some of the things you have been doing here, to the people here and also to the people online. If there are any questions or whatsoever, for me it's not necessary to wait until the end. We can just have a conversation ongoing, and there's lots of things we can talk about, and we'll simply see how far we will come with all of it, because, well, we started a bit later and we also wanted to finish everything. Having said that, also, I'm not really sure into everyone's background knowledge when it comes to the scroll or AI or things like that. I will just also share some generalities, and especially also with the scrolls, give some background. If it's all familiar terrain, please interrupt me and just say, we know all this, continue. Then I will simply continue. That's no problem at all. How do I get to the slides? Just this.
Yes, I do. So,
So can you do that into the PowerPoint?
Maybe not. Yes, no, I think it's working. No, but it's not moving here.
it's not moving.
Okay.
Is there any things that if we start here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's moving.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic.
Oh,
Thank you. I am presenting here, but I really want to emphasize this is a huge team effort. Research like this, where we combine many different disciplines in the humanities, the sciences, AI, you can't do that by yourself. So it's a big group of people. This is the core team, but there are many, many more involved that have been also involved. I will also name and show them later. We also have a team here from Italy, from Pisa, on board doing chemistry, chemical analysis of the cleaning procedures that we did on the scrolls before performing radiocarbon dates. I will say a bit more about that later. So this is not just me presenting here, it's really a team effort. And it moves. There it moves. Here it doesn't, but that's fine. I'll just look at the screen. So here I give you a brief overview of the talk. Briefly on the discovery and short history of research of the scrolls. Here, if it's all familiar terrain, please say so. I also give a few examples of texts just to illustrate why the discovery of these texts is so extremely important. It's now many decades ago, So it's all very familiar maybe to us, but that means that sometimes we don't have an idea how the world was and how we thought about Judaism in the ancient world before these manuscripts were discovered. And by we, I mean especially from Christian scholars in Europe and the US and so on. And then I will focus very specifically to one type of expertise when studying the scrolls, and that's paleography, the study of ancient handwriting. Then I will move on to integrating new technologies alongside traditional methods and how we develop interdisciplinary tools. And we focus in the project specifically on two fundamental questions: who wrote the manuscript and when was it written? So we named that writer identification, and the when question is character shape-based dating, which I will explain more later. And also why we focus on these two questions. If there is time, there are some new things we have been doing, and it's thinking about writing quality and the skills of the scribe. A bit provocatively, but can you quantify quality? Can you quantify beauty of writing and handwriting? But before I go there, I will at least also devote some time to new perspectives on what this research of us coming to the who and the when question means for biblical texts, literacy and history in the 3rd and 2nd century before the Common Era in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is all familiar terrain to you. I always show this to audiences so they know where we are at. This is the Roman Empire part of it, and in the southeast there is Judea near Nabatea and so on and so forth, which is where the scrolls were hidden about 2,000 years ago, and they were discovered in the 40s and 50s of the 20th century, at first by coincidence by two Bedouin, and then there was sort of a race between Bedouin and archaeologists to discover more of these caves with manuscripts preferably. And when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls in a specific sense, we refer to 11 caves near the ancient sites of what we call Qumran, which is not the ancient name Qumran. It's a name that we see appearing from the 19th century and maybe a bit earlier, but it's a modern name. And the site has been excavated by Roland de Vaux, who was head of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, and he excavated Qumran in the 50s. So here, a few further slides. De Vaux in the right down corner, and cave 4 in the middle, and also in the picture on the left above with the orange mark. There were that's the cave where most of the manuscripts were found. So when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls in a specific sense, we're talking about 11 caves, and in the reconstructed form, we think there were about 1,000 manuscripts. Can be 950, can be 960. And of course, the question is also, what is a manuscript? Because sometimes we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we have a few cases, about a dozen of really nice scrolls, 7, 8 meters in length, which you can roll out. But for the most part, we have thousands and thousands of bigger and smaller, and sometimes really tiny fragments, which scholars have sometimes reconstructed to say, okay, here we have these few fragments, or even sometimes just one, which is part of what was once a manuscript. So when we say 1,000 manuscripts, that doesn't mean we have 1,000 scrolls intact. Sometimes it's only a tiny remain of what was a manuscript, which could have been only a one-pager, or a few columns, or whatever. It's not always the case that we're dealing with big scrolls of 8, 9 meters in length. And I'll say a bit more about that later. So the first scrolls were found reportedly by the Bedouin in these jars, and they were wrapped in linen. And that's also probably the reason why the ones from cave 1, and presumably also those from cave 11, are so well preserved, because they were nicely sealed, wrapped in linen and sealed in these jars. And that means that no bats could fly over them and do their things there, or other animals eat, or this or that. And that's very different to a situation in cave 4, where most of the 1,000 manuscripts were found, around 600, which are very, very deteriorated. where we also were dealing with a lot of bat guano covering the manuscript, so it had all to be cleaned and so on. But this gives an illustration of that and also of the size. Here you have the international team on the left, upper Roland de Vaux in the middle, and you see them working in the Rockefeller Museum, the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem in the 50s. Jerusalem then was a divided city after 1948-49, the war between then the new state of Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and so on. Jordan was occupying the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So the École Biblique, together with the Judaean Department of Antiquities, was responsible then for all these scrolls coming in. And the Bedouin, the archaeologists struck a deal with the Bedouin. They said, look, don't go to the antiquities market, which is initially how they got to the knowledge of scholars, and it was a good thing because otherwise it made it go completely different. But they said, well, bring it to us and we'll pay you for it. And initially they made an agreement to pay by piece, and then the Bedouin in the beginning made smaller pieces of some bigger pieces, but they got more money, and then the deal was changed. We'll pay you by the so many each, so on and so forth. So here you see, for example, them working in the scrollery, all these fragments, a very different situation. You see down below on the left, John Strutt smoking a cigarette. In the middle is Gerald Lancaster Harding, the British director of the Judaean Department of Antiquities. He has a cigarette just hanging. There's no glass in between, and he's just checking the catch of the day or something like that. I don't know. And on the down right side is the director of the Palestine Archaeological Museum with the catch of the day, the Bedouin brought in all sorts of cigarette boxes whatsoever. And that's, I think, the summer of 52 or August or something like that, but I'm not sure. But it gives you an idea of, well, when they were reconstructing and getting all this material, and that took, well, decades. Initially, some of the material was quite quickly published, and then it took longer and longer because this quite small team, they had to go back to the universities and perform the tasks there. So these scrolls were found in these caves in the 40s and 50s. And of course, the obvious question is, well, how did they end up in those caves? I often show a clip. I don't know if it will work now because I can't start it here. I don't know if you have sound, and otherwise we'll just move on. I don't know what happens if I push this or, oh yeah. Sorry for the Dutch translation. So the first, what we call the first Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 until 70. There's a second one in the 2nd century, 132 to 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt in the first one. And from also the second one, we have these manuscript finds. So we assume that the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran were also hidden at this time. Also, when we look at the archaeological sites, Mladen Popović has argued, and others have followed him in that perhaps sometime around the summer of 68, when Vespasian was in the area, he's told to be in Jericho, visiting also the Dead Sea, because he also wants to know whether people can just, stay afloat, and looking at coins and things like that. It might be that that Qumran was also attacked in the summer of 68. Whether that is exactly the case or not, most probably those scrolls were then hidden at the time. If we look at other caves in the Judean Desert, not only these 11 in Qumran, but also broader in the Judean Desert, there we also have finds from the first revolt, but especially also from the second revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. There's not one, but there are several big differences if we compare these find sites archaeologically and when we look at what was found there. Qumran is, and the 11 caves of Qumran stand out because we find an enormous amount of what we call literary texts. Practically no documentary texts. When we look at these other find sites, we find predominantly documentary texts and a few nice literary scrolls. Plus, another big difference is at Qumran, we do not find human remains. So the people did not hide in those caves. They hid the manuscript. In those other caves, archaeologists found also human remains. Whole families fled to those caves. They took their belongings with them and also important papers, hence the documentary material. And also, it's as we noted, also some very important women were actually in charge and not the men. So we have the Mabata archive, the Salome Kumai's archive, that shows how they were in charge, owning land, this and that, and those kinds of things. When we look at other finds, we find, of course, jewelry. So when people flee, it's always good to have jewelry with you because you could sell it maybe and things like that. We also find pots and pans for food. Keys, lots of keys were also found. People locked their houses and thinking we will return. In some of those cases, like with those archives, we know where they came from. They, like Babata, they came from the southeast of the Dead Sea, and they went all around, as it were, near Ein Gedi, and there, perhaps via a relationship of family, they ended up in one of the caves. Unfortunately, the Romans knew where they were, or auxiliary troops, and they stayed there, and the people could not get out anymore. So they probably died of thirst and hunger. And the archaeologists then found the human remains of whole families. Sometimes, the bones of a 2- or 3-year-old child, adolescents, older people. And that, of course, is quite intense and moving. But also, for us as archaeologists, when we look again at the text, I said in addition to the documentary text, we also found a few literary manuscripts, right? So biblical scrolls, sometimes also what we call non-biblical scrolls, so other texts. We don't know exactly what they were because only small remains. But imagine the fleeing for your life with your family, and you take these scrolls also with you. That you have important papers with you is one thing, but also these literary texts. So it also shows something of the value attached to those manuscripts. But we think that also for the scrolls at Qumran, it indicates a literary, one could say, treasure trove. The people hid it there. They themselves were not hiding in those caves, but presumably they did not survive, or in any case, they never came back after the revolt to retrieve these manuscripts. So it has to wait for 2,000 years for the Bedouin come. Well, there are Eusebius talks about a fight in the 3rd century, a shepherd with his dog stumbling upon ancient manuscripts, and he thinks it's Hebrew, so he brings it to the Jews, something like that. And there's around here 800, a few letters exchanged between a bishop and so on. That's again a text fight was happening there. But otherwise, we don't know what happened to those texts, and it really is until the modern era that we find them. And it is an extremely important time in human history. I showed you this clip. I mean, the building of the Colosseum, reportedly, the station in Titus had a inscription in which they made clear that this was paid for by the spoils from the war with the Jews. So now I want to go to the scrolls. Why are they so important? For many reasons. I already mentioned a few. I mean, it's a time machine. It allows us to go back. And this also shows where before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we were talking about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. We were reliant on medieval manuscripts and the codices. It's also a book, codex. It's not a scroll. And one very important one, the Codex Leningradensis from the year 2008, 2009, was always used also in scientific research because it's the oldest, most entirely preserved manuscript of the Old Testament in Hebrew, and also some parts in Aramaic, of course. But when you look at the Old Testament, it's still 1,000, 2,000 years later. So we have a huge gap. And yeah, the scrolls are so important because it allows us to travel back in time, 1,000 years from medieval time or 2,000 years from us. And yeah, we see no codices, that's scrolls. So we have the same culture of writing material as we have in the Hebrew Bible. And there's also an overlap in time between them, between the oldest Dead Sea Scrolls and the youngest books of the Hebrew Bible, which is the book of Daniel, the book of Ecclesiastes, and so on. But the scrolls are extremely important because they are like a time machine and allow us to go back and see what was then available, what were people reading, what were they thinking. So it's not because of tradition, but tradition decided was worthwhile to keep preserving, or by chance, by war, or things like that. Many things simply go lost, not because people want it, but because of it happens. So the scrolls are extremely important, and they also show us, when we look at the Hebrew tradition, we have around the year 1000 what we call the Masoretic tradition, which goes back a bit earlier than that. We see that in Galilee, where they are involved with the correct transmission of the text. But then around that time, we see a uniform text, as it were. Go to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have textual uniformity of Hebrew manuscripts. Of course, when we look at other traditions, the Latin tradition, Greek tradition, we know that there were differences between these different translations and the Hebrew text. When we look, for example, at the Greek tradition, often people discuss, scholars discuss, were these Greek translators created themselves, thinking this can be done better, shorter, with different order, like for example with the book of Jeremiah, or that they have a different version, a different voorlage of the Hebrew text in front of them. That's so nice about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We find there in Hebrew the type of manuscript of the Greek tradition, but in Hebrew, going back 2,000 years. But it's pluriformity. We also find in Hebrew, of Jeremiah, for example, the Masoretic tradition. So the Masoretic tradition is not just an invention from the Middle Ages. It also goes back to around the year 0, as it were, around the turn of the era. So we have these different traditions next to each other. For the Pentateuch, we also have the Samaritan Pentateuch type of manuscripts there, and when it comes to biblical manuscripts, we also talk about something what we call unaligned texts. So there's a variety there. In addition to, say, around a bit over 200 manuscripts of 1,000 are biblical, so most of them are non-biblical. Some of them we knew before, like the book of Enoch or the book of Jubilees, via the Ethiopian tradition. And here we find them back in the original Hebrew and Aramaic, Hebrew for Jubilees, Aramaic for Enoch. But there were many, many, many texts we had no idea about that existed at all. And one of them, I always like to mention, because I did my dissertation on it many, many years ago, was also astrological and physiognomic texts. For example, also magical texts, which is interesting because often, Jews and also Christians, they weren't allowed to do that because the Bible says no. Okay, that can be the norm, certain kind of text, but it doesn't mean that people don't do it. So we also find those kinds of texts, and many, many, many other beautiful texts that really changed the way we think about ancient Judaism at the time. And to give a few examples, this is the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. This is actually a manuscript. It's found at Qumran, and this one was actually found at Masada, more to the south. So not so further south in the Judean Desert, really near the Dead Sea. And this is a fascinating text. It's almost mystical, maybe, or it gives the start of a mystical view of how, at the same time that people perform the liturgy, then the angels do that as well. Some have even said it's maybe a sort of a precursor, not in literary sense, but in terms of thinking of Dante's Divina Commedia, because he also travels beyond the normal world. And Virgil takes him, so I don't have to explain that here, I'm sure. But here you have the same playing around, but the same thinking of, when reading from liturgy, there's a synchronicity between us and the ancients. It's a fascinating liturgical and also mystical manuscript. This one is also nice to look at because it's horrible. Probably there was something in the ink that was eating its way in the manuscripts. We call this the Genesis Apocryphal. It's the first couple of chapters from the book of Genesis that have been preserved. But interestingly, Noah, Enoch, Abraham are not talked about in the third person, but they talk themselves in the first person. I, Abraham, so and so and so. It's in Aramaic also. Presumably it would have been composed sometime in the early second century BCE, and it gives us an interesting view of how they were reading the Bible, because the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, beautiful stories, and sometimes it's so well told that we as listeners go along and don't mind any gaps in the text. And gaps are beautiful because they make you think. Yeah, so, for example, the famous story in Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarah are in the country, and finally, so they have to come all the way from Ur, and they get there, and then there's a famine, so they have to go to Egypt. And then the Bible says, Abraham tells Sarah to say she's not his wife, but his sister, because he's afraid to be killed. And then this Genesis Apocryphal has some issues with all of this. They want to make it clear. So, for example, Abraham, he's the great ancestor, so he cannot be a coward nor a liar, right? So when they move here from Canaan to Egypt, it's night, and Abraham has a dream, and the dream is, of course, a message from God. And God tells him what to do. So it's not Abraham himself being a coward or a liar. He simply listens to God. He tells, when he wakes, he tells his dream to Sarah, and Sarah says, okay, let's do it like this and that. So they agree. There are many, many other great elements in there. Maybe if there's time later, we'll get back to this. But it's important because just to take one story, one part out of it. In Genesis 12, the Pharaoh is hit with plagues, but it's very non-personal, right? And when he comes to Abraham, it's done, and Abraham just moves. Here in Genesis book of Phone, it's much more convoluted. Many more things happen. So when the Pharaoh finally appears before Abraham, there's a ritual being performed. It's described. Abraham lays his hands on the head of the Pharaoh and says a prayer, and then the evil spirit leaves the body of the Pharaoh. So it's an exorcism. And that reminds us very much of how Jesus also performs exorcism in the New Testament. This is a nice example of how the earliest Christianity is not something completely new. It has clear Jewish roots, which now, after so many decades, this is quite normal. But when these scrolls were found, it was extremely important because it completely changed the way how we looked at Judaism at the time. There are many, many examples of how in European scholarship, also North American scholarship, Judaism at this time, around the turn of the era, was viewed very negatively. Only law-abiding, no creativity. The real creativity was many centuries before with the prophets and so on. But here you see the reality was really different. There is no such end for centuries, and then we have to await Christianity, and then all of a sudden all new things come. Christianity starts as a Jewish group, Jesus as a Jewish person in ancient Judea, and the way Jesus is portrayed and how he's talked about is in many ways influenced by the surrounding Jewish culture. This is just one example of it, and maybe another one. When it comes to Jesus as Messiah, you see in the New Testament that to anchor that Jesus really is the Messiah, they connect with the Old Testament, where certain texts are seen as precursing, pointing to the Messiah. And Isaiah is very important in that. Isaiah 61, one of the Psalms, and so on. And you see then also those things being merged. So blind will see, the deaf will hear again. In the New Testament also they add to that, and the dead will live again, the dead will rise. But that is not in Isaiah nor in the Psalms. So that was often seen as an innovation in Christianity, with Jesus also after 3 days resurrecting and so on. But this is an interesting text. It talks about that the heavens and the earth will listen to his Messiah. It's the first line in the middle on the right above. And then you have also these combination of texts from Isaiah and Psalms. And then also the deaf will hear, the blind will see, and the dead shall rise. And here you have a manuscript from the 2nd century before the Common Era. So you see that also in the way early Christianity talks about Jesus as a Messiah, the words they use, the way they combine texts, they inherited that from an earlier Jewish tradition to think like that about the Messiah, and to connect those texts like that, and to add to those texts like that. So, some scholars have even said maybe a text like this was even used by the New Testament authors to compose it. There's no way of really assessing that, but it at least shows that they were sharing the same tradition, same hermeneutical tradition of explaining texts, connecting them, adding to them, and then applying it to Messiah. So these are a few examples of the background of the scrolls, a little bit only of the history of research, and then I would really like to focus on the paleography, the study of ancient forms of handwriting, where we dive in then. Just to be sure, are there any questions? So thus far, I don't know at online or here. It's okay. I have a question for you. Here is one manuscript. I can say maybe a bit more about it later. It's not necessary now. I want to ask you, also those online, a mistake was made in this manuscript, and it has been corrected. Who can find it?
Oh, yeah, there's something written over the line, or middle here.
Yeah, exactly. And so, why do we look at handwriting? Well, it really gives us a unique access to ancient scribes. That's the beauty of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We don't have later manuscripts, but we can go back in time, and we have tangible evidence that we can look at. And indeed, for example, very simple here, you can see these ancient scribes in action. And so, writing practice, the X of maybe indicates a reading context. I won't take that down too much. But this is why it's so nice to look again at paleography. The paleography was used initially when these scholars in Rockefeller and Jerusalem were connecting the bits and pieces, looking for the same type of writing, to look at the same, and so on. And then it wasn't used that much anymore, and I think there's really value in looking again at the paleography, and I will explain a bit more why that is so interesting, also worthwhile. Here it's from cave 11, Psalm scroll. It's a bit different than the Psalms that we have in the Hebrew Bible at the moment, and in our translations as well, especially towards the end. There are more Psalms here, and the order of the individual Psalms can be different. And here again, it's also an interesting feature, just to let your eyes get used to it. I don't know if you already know how to read Hebrew, that is sort of citing a role. If you don't, even then you can see certain things. There's one word written differently than the others. The word has 4 letters. Can you spot it? Can you describe what you see?
It's like a fork. I don't know, something like.
So I cannot indicate it yet. No idea if people can see it there.
Yeah, it's released in many parts of the text. Exactly.
Do you have an idea what that word might be?
Means the words.
No. Yeah, very good. It's the 4 letters of the divine name. Yod, He, Va, Yod. And here you have it written in what we call Paleo-Hebrew. That's the Hebrew that was written from, say, the first half of the first millennium BC, say around the 1000 until the year, sometime in the 6th century. It shares it with Phoenician. So the Phoenician then gave rise to the Greek alphabet. It is also Moabite and so on. There's a Paleo-Hebrew, the original script of writing. Then in the 6th century, they moved to Aramaic script, which is how the rest is written. Some scholars discuss whether they kept writing Paleo-Hebrew or reused it again at a certain time, but I won't go into that detail now. But these are just a few very simple examples of how looking at the manuscript, looking at the physical evidence, looking at the paleography, the handwriting, we can learn lots of things simply by looking at it. Yeah, here's another one. This is just one page, and presumably 3 of those went into the other manuscript. It's a big one there. Here again, the divine name is written. Can you spot it? The 4 letters of the divine name. And it's not written in the same way that you saw previously. So it's in a different way, but again, it's the 4 characters.
It is over there is a short line over some letters, 3 or 4 points.
Yeah. Can you say again what you said at the end? The 4
points.
4 points. Yeah, very good. So you have them here.
Yeah.
And you have the
And there,
yeah. So here's someone, this is one page, you collected 4 quotes from the Pentateuch. This is what we call from Joshua, but different. The apocrypha of Joshua, and we actually found also a manuscript that has this text in there, the apocrypha of Joshua. So here, someone writing it down with 4 dots. We think with the Paleo-Hebrew, maybe that was because of a reference for the name of God. Here, I don't know. Maybe that was just a way of doing it for this person, or for more persons than just one. And also in some cases, divine name was just written, so in the same script. So it's not a rule that this happened all the time. We see also how scribes treated manuscripts. There's diversity in that, and variety. So the important thing of Dead Sea Scrolls, how I approach them, and I still haven't mentioned anything about, say, the name of the people responsible for these scrolls. We can talk about it, I'll mention it later, but I look at it as a textual community because of the tangible evidence, the archaeological artifacts that the manuscripts are. And yeah, but you know, however you look at text, I was just before the lecture here in the library. People collect texts, but texts also collect people. Right, so there where we have books and texts, all sorts of social activities take place, engaging with the text in all sorts of different ways. So looking at the people responsible for these scrolls as a textual community, as a real micro-society around manuscripts and texts. And then to the fundamental questions, the who and the when question, and that is because we don't know, there are no names in the manuscripts. We don't know who copied them. And there are also no dates in the manuscripts. So we don't know exactly when they were copied. Based on paleography, I mentioned that in the beginning it was used to connect different fragments with each other because it's the same style of writing, it's very different, it doesn't belong together. And then also one of the scholars, Frank Cross, very geniusly reconstructed, and also using the work of others, Albright, and those others did what he did, but he did very thoroughly a dating model based on paleography. And I'll explain later why there were some problems with it, but it was used then also for dating, but there was no date in the manuscript to connect it with and then also to check it against. So we ask these 2 fundamental questions, who and when, and I will dive a bit more into that because this was the focus of the ERC project that I ran, the hands that wrote the Bible. It's finished, but yeah, I'll share some of the results with you. We then also, for the when question, perform new radiocarbon analysis, and like that, we've got new C14 dates that we use to train an algorithm to date the manuscripts which have no C14 date. Okay, what is our data? in addition to physical samples for C14, that's of course the images, digitized images that are made by the Leon Levi Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library of the Israel Antiquities Authority, also with the support of Google, where they have a fantastic photo project, photographing in all different kinds of wavelengths these manuscripts. We also use earlier digitized forms of the manuscript by the publisher Brill from Leiden, from the Netherlands. And this is, when it comes to the photographic data, our evidence, our data. And here you can see how many images we're dealing with, and also the differences in their way of photographing and digitizing. So, you have here an example of these different wavelengths. Some are very dark for a human eye, not that valuable, but for the computer, very valuable. So we experimented with all the wavelengths, and that was a lot of work I mentioned at the beginning. Many more names. So Maruf Dali, he was a PhD on the project, supervised by Lambert Schoonmaker for the AI part, and he did all sorts of experiments, which kinds of images would give the best results for computerized analysis. So I have to emphasize we're dealing with ancient handwriting, So with historical manuscripts, we have style development over time, the way you write now, and people write less and less. I don't know how it's here in Italy, but in the Netherlands, students complain and they have to write exams, and after a few hours, their hands hurt. And it reminds us of how much muscle movement goes into writing.
Yes.
We forgot, because we, older people, just did it from a young age, and you forgot the pain that was in there, and you just do it. But because we don't do it so often anymore, it's an enormous amount of muscle movement that goes in there. That makes it also very individual. I'll explain it later why this is important. So you have style development over time. People now write differently than 100 years ago, and that's also the basis for paleography. You can use that for dating style over time. You have variations between writers. All of us here have different handwritings, but you have also variability within a writer. You never write the same letter in exactly the same way. There's a certain kind of within writer variability. So there are many tasks one can do in handwriting recognition. We focused on who and when, as I mentioned, and I will take you through it. Because with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we had these manuscripts, and people ventured like, well, more manuscripts, a number of so many, or 2 or 3 or 10, were written by one scribe. So we have a number of those examples. Or we have questions, did one scribe copy a manuscript, or were there more scribes working on those manuscripts? But before you can really answer it, we really have to work with the data. And for us as human beings, we did a bit of playing around earlier. I asked you, can you see the different way of writing? And we, with our human eyes, we are pattern recognition machines ourselves. We do it. And also here, we easily see what is foreground and what is background. We easily see what is handwriting and what is papyrus or parchment, the background. But the computer doesn't just know. You really have to train a computer to be able to get to what you want, namely only this. And why is this extremely important? We were the first ones succeeding in it for these manuscripts, because handwriting, as I mentioned, is muscle movement. If I, with my human eyes, retrace the handwriting and then write it, which you often see in paleographic charts, it's my muscle movement, not the one of the ancient scribe. And we want that because that's the individual scribe. So we really want to come as close as possible to these ancient scribes, shaking their hands, as it were. And this is why we extract the ink traces, which are the results of the muscle movement by scribes more than 2,000 years ago, as they were left on the manuscripts, appear on these digitized images of these manuscripts. So this has taken quite some time to do that, and lots of training. And everything that we do with AI and that we've done in our project, we tried, of course, tools that are already available, but yeah, we really have to develop our own tools. There's no quick win if you really want to get robust results. So for this character extraction, many of the PhDs and postdocs and students and also some of the senior researchers trained on pixel level, first filling in what is ink and what is not ink. And of course, because you have more people doing it, you get a good cross section, because sometimes a person will say this is still ink and this one is not anymore on pixel level. But if you have enough people doing that, it's not, it filters itself out. So, with the character on the left, yeah, we can all read it. It's nice, clear parchment. But you see the one on the right, it's very damaged, and the one in the middle is very dark. So it's very difficult to read. And there you really want the computer to be able to do the work properly. So Maruf worked with already existing character extraction tools. But as you can see, the computer doesn't just do what you want it to do. You can see the color bar still there, and all sorts of other problems that you want to take away of, because otherwise the computer might put two things together for the wrong reason. And then you're not sure if it really is the same scribe or a change of scribes. And what you want is to get there what we see manually labeled, so a person did. And yeah, we know that you need to take out the color bar and things like that. You only want that. So this is how we started to train the computer. Look only for the ink traces. And that's easier said than done. So there comes in AI. And it starts with recognizing digits, as I mentioned, on pixel level. And it then continues to that we really want to be able to extract the characters, binarize them, but you only see the ink. So what Maruf Dali developed is Binance, this character extraction redefined, and developing an advanced deep learning-based ink background separation method, which the code, everything is available. If people also have these good images, they can simply perform it themselves and don't have to write themselves, but they get the type of writing as it appears on the individual manuscript, which is extremely important if you want to do robust analysis then on the style of writing. So here, an example of what we get that with. And you see two manuscripts that we already saw before. And if you go closer, you'll see it better. Now it's maybe a bit smaller, so on your own there. But you can see all the characters, and especially also when it is very dark, that the computer can see much more than we can see. So it's also very valuable for extracting more data than we would otherwise be able to extract. So I showed you before the different multispectral images, and here an example, the color one, and then three of the other types, very dark, lighter, more dark, and they are fused together in a new what we call pseudo-color image. That's the green one on the bottom left. And that is the basis for the where the binarization is applied to them. And then here to just give a brief example, this was manually labeled by one of the researchers. And then, we do see some letters above and below, but we're not really sure, etc. So we just leave it away. And you can see here with the binarization, it's able to see more than we are. And so you can see above, it's able to see more letters, and also below, it's able to see more than we are able to see. This can also sometimes aid in manuscript reconstruction when it comes to what was actually written there. So to give you an example of writer identification, here you have the Great Isaiah Scroll, more than 7 meters in length. And in 2020, I just gave it as an example, as a test to Maruf, saying, "Oh, can you have a look? Do you have one scribe in here, or do you have more?" And I wasn't predisposed or biased that it had to be one or more or not. I was just interested in how does the analysis work? How does the evidence look like that? And Yeah, first you have to binarize it. So here you see that example of how that was done. And then what happens on the AI, also the feature extraction analysis is performed. So all kinds of measurements are performed. And this is all transparent in the sense of, if you want, you can see all these numerical results, all these quantified results of these measurements. And we performed mainly with hinge, looking at slant information and curvature. And here again, I work with Marou and with Lambert, Marou Dali and Lambert Schoonmaker. So that's the beauty of having this interdisciplinary team. I'm not a specialist in AI, but I have to understand what they are doing, and especially what the outcome is, what that means, and how the results can be interpreted. So also for us as teamwork, working aside, we have lots of conversations, really trying to understand each other's disciplines, because you don't want to run away with the wrong interpretation of the results from one discipline and then build on a wrong interpretation in another discipline elsewhere, because then the further results will fail. So they have all different sorts of feature extraction. Simply put, looking at the whole character, the whole allograph, or minute parts of it, and detailed parts of the letter. Simply looking, because it's human handwriting, like when you drive the car, when you bicycle. I don't know if you bicycle a lot here, but certainly saw a lot of cars. When you go straight, you can go fast. When you're in a curve, you have to slow down. The same when we write with our muscle movement. So these are all kinds of measurements that are performed to understand what kind of handwriting activity was taking place. And because all our handwriting is different, this allows for individual identification, because muscle movement is quite individual in this sense. And this was based on previous research testing all that. So here you see exploiting both what we call textual and allographic information, constructing a joint factor for both shape features, and then what we do, dimensionality reduction, to find key components. So because there's so much analysis, it's difficult for us to, take into account all of it. So we simplify it, and we also work with 3D models then for visual representation. Here's an example. So when we say, how distant from each other, when we look at the numbers, is a manuscript. If you would look at it two-dimensional, then it seems like, oh, this is quite close. But when you turn it around three-dimensional, it might indeed be further away in another aspect. But this makes it possible to see whether manuscripts are together or further apart from each other. And this we also performed on the great Isaiah scroll, this big scroll of 7 meters, more than 7 meters in length. And when Marou came back, the plot on the left, he said, I don't know, but they are very close to each other. It's like a piece of paper in between, but I really have two sections, two parts that have clearly a different pattern. And then in the second step, after the principal component analysis, that's the plot on the left, then on the right, Lambert Schoonmaker performed statistical analysis to see if the signal source was indeed significantly different. And it is. It's not just one shot, but somewhere between columns 27 and 30, there's a change gradually. So there's another signal source, as we say. And what we also did, you can see the letters on the right. This is one of the columns from Isaiah. You can see them dancing, as it were. I think I can make it a bit bigger. You can see it a bit better. We also put noise in the data after our analysis to see if the result is still the same. And of course, within certain constraints, it's all checks and balances, so it's all transparent. And the same result comes out again. So the result is robust, that we found that you have indeed two different signal sources here. Now, this is the AI part, so it's all quantified. Now I go back to the human again, and our human eyes. As a post-hoc analysis, we also did a visual analysis. Now, what you often see when you do paleography, ancient handwriting, paleographers, they pick out what they see as a typical example of a letter or this or that, and you can make charts. And a paleographer might say, but there's no use for me in all these charts, because I cannot look at so many examples of one letter. That's precisely the point. So how do we as humans, of course, with expert knowledge, so it's often implicit and it's trained on many, many years of experience, but it's difficult to bring that across. How we decide that, yeah, you have to look at this only one feature. And you see the aleph on the left and the shin on the right. The aleph appears more than 5,000 times in this manuscript. I cannot look at so many of those and then decide that it's the same on different scribe. So this is where the computer also comes in useful because it can take into account a lot of data. And normally as paleographers, we would look for a smoking gun saying, look, this, you see, this letter is always written like this. This particular feature on the letter is typical for this scribe. But this is not the way that the computer looks. It doesn't look for a smoking gun. It looks at all the way of how a person writes, the muscle movement, and does geometric shape-based analysis on the basis of that, the whole letter and parts of the letter. It decides whether you have there. It doesn't decide, but it gives you the data for saying, hey, here you have the same signal source signal or a different one. So, for example, here, when we look at letters, we would look at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. But then one particular example, how meaningful is that? It's just one of it's 5,000. But if you look at hundreds of them, as we did here on an aggregated level, then small differences might become interesting. Again, this is post hoc, so this is not the evidence in the first 2 steps that the computer gave us this result of 2 different sources. This is how we could look at it as humans afterwards with these heat maps. And then you can see very minute differences maybe between the aleph and the resh, for example, of how 2 scribes, I now already jumped to the conclusion, a bit different. Like here, the length starts a little bit higher, and here a little bit lower. If it's only one example, then it's just one. But if it's hundreds and hundreds, then you have a more significant factor. That's where the heat map can come useful. Again, this is post hoc visual analysis. So it might be interesting for us to look at and to understand how they might be different. But also how they might be very similar, because as humans we never were able to really distinguish these 2 scribes. So despite the near uniform handwriting, there is a clear separation between 2 writing styles, 2 different signal sources. The separation between the 2 styles coincides with the codicological separation between columns 27 to 29 and the 2 halves of the manuscript. Because in column 28, the last 3 lines are left empty, and a new chapter starts on column 28, and the new book starts on 29, a new chapter. And everywhere else in the manuscript, when a new chapter begins on the final line, they simply started there. They don't wait till a new column. And also, this is the end of a sheet, so a new sheet was soon on there. So we have also these codicological indications, and now also we have this paleographic evidence using AI. So here you see the whole model that ran. We published this in 2021, and also with this visual analysis, we can then think further. If we have 2 scribes here, we have here maybe an example of the mimetic ability of one scribe to mirror the writing style of another scribe, or maybe they were trained in the same school. There are all sorts of new options to think about, and this is what our research has also done, to open a new level of studying this writing in the ancient world and to understand how they were working. And also when it comes to these variation, we also demonstrate that the second scribe shows a bit more variation in his writing than the first scribe. So the first scribe is much more, is a bit more consistent than the second one is. But not only that they have a different signal source, but also in the way that they show variation. Second scribe, when he continues writing, shows a bit more variation, a bit more than the first one does. Interestingly, my colleague Marcello Financio, who's at Lugano University, he's studying the Isaiah scroll also from a material point of view, looking at the manuscript, and we presented evidence saying, hey, this first half, the second half maybe also existed separately from each other before they were sewn together. Because in the one half, it was not rolled, but he sees evidence for that it was folded instead of rolled. And one question is, of course, were they writing in a different time or at the same time? And I will come back to that later as a small cliffhanger. So let's go to the dating. How are we doing in time? Okay, if there are any questions, please just interrupt them. So in addition to this who question, who wrote the manuscript, we were also very interested in the when question, and we developed what I called the Enoch model. Enoch, I already mentioned this manuscript by Enoch. I chose the name Enoch because of him being, I call him sort of an ancient Jewish science hero, because through his literature, we see a Jewish use of ancient astronomy, calendrical science, and so on and so forth. So, and also a sociological way of predictions and so on. So I thought it was very appropriate to call our dating model by the AI the Enoch model. And that is what we developed in the years project, and that's the Close Bible. So we had a paleography problem with the dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was a very ingenious system developed by Kos, and overall, it seems very valid because, say, from the 4th century, we clearly see a development to the 4th century BC to the 1st and 2nd century CE. But when it comes to the new differences and developments in between, there are no dated evidence which connected with, although that was claimed. So we thought it was very important to have physical, material-based evidence from radiocarbon dating as sort of ground truths around the timeline to base the training of the model on. And another empirical evidence source is what we use is geometric writing style based evidence that we also use for the writer identification. So you have two types of empirical evidence. And yeah, in a very simple sense, we published this last June. We take C14 samples of a number of manuscripts. Those you use to train the model, an AI model, to recognize a certain style of time, to associate a certain type of writing with a certain time range. And if you have enough of those, you then give other manuscripts that were not tested before by C14 or otherwise, and then ask the model, okay, having learned what you have learned, where would you put these on the timeline? Yeah, we were very successful in that. So when the model was trained, it had more than 85% of success, finding the same type of writing with the C14 tested training that it had received. It was world news in June. So here I am at a Dutch national news broadcasting something that was quite fun. But to get into the research, we performed radiocarbon dating in Groningen. We also had laboratories in Pisa and Odense performing cleaning and other checks and balances from chemistry. Because when we started working on these manuscripts in the 50s, sometimes they were very dark. And you saw some of these very dark examples, and they used castor oil, and that would make it a bit easier to read the handwriting on it. But castor oil is a modern product using oil. Exactly. So if you don't clean it properly, you will skew the dating into too modern periods. So that has to be really done, and that was performed in Odense in Denmark by Kara Rasmussen, and then Perla Colombini and her team, Ilaria Degano and Jacopo Lanassa. They analyzed the extracts from the cleaning in Odense to check indeed whether it was fully clean, and could then proceed to Groningen for further dating. So here you see in blue the radiocarbon results. You see in red the previous estimates from traditional paleography. So sometimes there's overlap, but often the radiocarbon dates are older. In only a few cases they are younger. So This one, for example, 4201 here, and 11Q5 in that case. But in many cases, they are older, and I'll briefly run you through it. As I said, we have from the 4th century until the 1st, 2nd century CE, we have no dated manuscripts, except one Ostracon from the year 176 BCE. But you can't use that, although some scholars have just said it. They said, oh, this validates the traditional model, but it's impossible. But one dated manuscript with so few letters in the middle can support the whole model for a couple of centuries. It doesn't. So we had to take that further. And here you have a few examples of the manuscripts that we dated. Now note that when I showed you the chart earlier, I've shown only one dating range for the C40, but we have often, not in all cases, we have bimodal evidence. We have two dating possibilities. And that simply has to do with, you see that the background, when you have the BP date, this is the date that comes out of the C40, and when you have to convert it to a calendar date, it's not a linear line, but it fluctuates. So in some cases, we have two possible dates. What we did, and anyone who wants, they can debate it with us, we said, well, this one, the older date really isn't possible, because when we come into the 4th and 5th century, we have an Aramaic dated examples, and then the handwriting is so very different that although from C40 you have two possibilities, we can say with the additional evidence or knowledge that we have, domain knowledge as we call it, we can say, well, we will leave this one out in a further analysis. But anyone who wants, everything is there. So we didn't leave out any data. Everything was published, so everyone, if they want, they can look at all of it. And we gave all traditional paleographic analysis, as well as taking it further and working with the selected date range. So that was the combination to train the model. And we also decided to go for not what is normally the case, the 1 sigma, but for the 2 sigma probability, because then we wanted to have a broad range, as broad range as possible. And it's also important to emphasize, normally in archaeology, when you have C40 results, we use the whole range. We say, oh, it could be between 200 and 150. But actually, we work with the raw C14 data, and it's not equally distributed. Also within a time range, it has different probability values. We used all of that evidence in training the model. Also using these kind of smaller humps, you could say, just ignore those, you can leave them in. We did all of the tests, taking them into account, also not taking them into account, and the effect of that was it's almost zero. But again, we did it just to be very thorough and very robust to show what the effect is of certain choices that you make in the research. So we take all of that, as we show here. Now again, here as with writer identification, we are dealing with data preparation. You see the whole what I discussed before. The images must be binarized, and then you have the binarized evidence, and on that you run the dating assessment. And the model was trained on C40 tested material, and then you simply ask it, or simply, but you ask it to compare it. And where we as humans, we do paleography for data, we often look for difference. Say, oh, this is written differently. This is something for follow-up research for us, maybe. The model looks not for difference, but for similarities. But it's a different approach. It's also interesting methodologically when it comes to how we would do a CMD paleography. Maruf performed also the data balancing and normalization. I won't go into those details now, but just to share with you that it was thoroughly tested and demonstrating the robust results that we have achieved. So to give one example, here you have 4Q259. That was a manuscript that we did C14. And there you see the C14 result. And this was used to train the model. Maybe it's good to say, when we train a model, we have all sorts of images of a manuscript. What we did is we used an X number of manuscripts to train a model, and a number of those images of the same manuscript we left out. And that we used to test, again feeding the different images of the same manuscript to the model, and then seeing does it find it with like. We also ran an experiment in 2021, and I will show you that in a second. So this is all the, well, I won't go into those, all the cross-validation that we did. I mentioned more than 85% overlap, and so on. Okay, so here. So here you see, again, 4259 above, you see the bimodal evidence for 4259, which is a manuscript of the community rule, the Serach HaYachad, in which they explain who they are, why they are a group, and so on. And below, you see another manuscript, 4Q319, which is polemical text. It has a different number, and that is because in the history of research, people took those two apart for generic reasons. They say, oh, the calendar text will publish separately from the community rule text. But the manuscript is the same, it belongs together. So we gave that one as a test also to Maruf, not telling him all of this. I didn't tell him all that. He came back and says, and this is quite striking. I have the same distribution pattern as with the C14 data for 42259. And so if you leave out the two early Bible references here, and you go into this one, you see that it is the same. And also here, seeing another possibility for a similarity in there. So it has indeed, again, also in this case, there's find the like with like. It illustrates the robustness of the model to find what belongs together in terms of style of handwriting. So now it's ready to use, and people are using it, and they can test it for their own manuscripts. So we also ourselves tested 135 manuscripts to produce date predictions for Enoch as a post-op operation. And to give one example of Isaiah, I mentioned these two scribes, were they writing at the same time or not? Now, here you have different parts of columns of the two different halves, and when we look at it in terms of dating, they really show the same pattern. So they were working at more or less the same time, and yeah, we go for the simplest explanation. People maybe said, yeah, couldn't he have been much older and then picked up writing again 40 years later? There's no evidence for that. And yeah, maybe that this is data, and we can then think about it. It's scenarios. And so as my colleague Marcello said, the two halves maybe existed apart from each other, but maybe they were written quite close to each other in time and maybe also in space. But it's not necessary. It could be that the other scribe imitated the handwriting of the scribe he did not know. And those are just scenarios we can start thinking about. We haven't found any proof or anything yet, but it's again a nice way of showing how this new data that we get from the manuscripts makes it possible to think anew about how these ancient scribes worked on these manuscripts. Because the Great Isaiah scroll was not only written originally by two scribes, but for decades and decades later, about 100 years, other people also intervened in the manuscript. So it was not a book that was read and say, oh, here, but people sometimes wrote whole lines or a word or this or that in there. So it's also interesting to see how a manuscript is a used artifact also in the ancient world. That people keep working on it, keep working with it, reading it, but also adding to it. Okay. So the advantages of our model, I would say, is a quantified objectivity to paleography. So instead of only experts saying, I think this is that date or that or so, it reduces paleographic subjectivity because you have this quantified basis underneath. And it also challenges the paleographer to explicate it's his or her expert knowledge. So it's not the end of the human expert. On the contrary, it puts the human expert in the driver's seat, because it's not just saying, oh, I listen to the computer. No, you have to interpret the results. And it gives what we say with Enoch when it comes to dating, there's a limited number of probability-based options on empirical grounds, as I mentioned. And it helps paleographers to substantiate, refine, or modify their own estimate that they might have had of a manuscript. Now, when it comes, and I will end because of time with this, and will not go into the quality of the handwriting now. When we're in the ancient world, when we think about publication of texts, there are no publishers, right? Two examples are quite interesting. You will see here a manuscript of Daniel, 4Q114. That's this one. There were more fragments of there. Two of the big fragments got lost in the 60s. And here you have 4Q119, the book of Ecclesiastes. This was C14 tested by us, and this was given a date estimate by Enoch after it was trained. Now, the book of Daniel, this manuscript was dated by Samuel Cross and then also G. Lurie to around the year 125 to 100 BCE, so the end of the 2nd century BCE. And Cross and then also Lurie said, this is one of the oldest manuscripts of the Bible we have in the sense of closest to its writer. It's only one generation after, because in scholarship, Daniel is dated to around the year 170, 160 BCE, the finalization of the book. I won't go into those details now, but that's where it's often put. So when you go to the end of the 2nd century, it's only like 40 years after. The C14 date that we got for this manuscript is 230 BCE to 160 BCE. So it's exactly the same time. It overlaps with when the author of the book of Daniel was active. So this invites all sorts of ways of thinking about, was the text already published? Was it spread very quickly? Is this the author Daniel himself? If not, why not? I don't think he is, but so it brings us even closer to exactly the time of the biblical author and allows for analysis also of the social context in which he was active. The same for the book of Ecclesiastes, which is dated to the 3rd century BCE. With the Enoch estimate, the manuscript was dated to 300 to 260 BC or 290 to 240. I forget which one, but at least the first half of the 3rd century BCE. And that's really what happens with the scrolls that we did. We have a new chronology of Dead Sea Scrolls in which not all, but many of the manuscripts are older than previously thought. So instead of having a number of them, very few in the 2nd century or 3rd century maybe, then a bit more in the 2nd, but the bulk in the 1st century BC and later, we will have many, many more now in the 2nd century BCE, but also the 3rd century BCE, and in 2 cases even in the 4th century BCE. So that means that our view of literacy in the area, but also history, could change. And so just to give one example, when we look at the people behind the scrolls, now I mentioned them, the Qumran community or the Essenes or the Yagat, as they might have called themselves, those groups have been seen often in research as the result after the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean rulers, the high priests and the kings. And when they have their independence from the Seleucids, they built their own empire, they need administration, bureaucracy, hence a rise in literacy. People also started reading their text themselves, the holy text, and then have their own ideas, hence the start of these groups like Qumran, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and so on. But if the texts are not post-Maccabean, but if many of them preceded, then literacy is not a result or a consequence of the Maccabean revolt, but it precedes it is much earlier. So we have much more going on in the 3rd century BCE and the early 2nd century BCE than we previously were able to think. So this changes the way we look at the 3rd and 2nd century and the interaction going on in the area between Jewish groups, Ptolemies maybe, the Seleucids, and so on. This was, of course, not the the basis of our research, but the new chronology that we devised opens up a rethinking of these kinds of things also in the Eastern Mediterranean part of the ancient world. I want to leave it at that for now, because otherwise I go over too.
Thank you.